in the modeling industry, it seems like a very glamorous business. Models are not the people you think of when you think
New
of
York, under fluorescent lights, not runway strobes. A woman sits behind a microphone, posture steady, voice measured. Years earlier, those same shoulders carved a perfect line down catwalks for Prada, Chanel, and Dolce Gabbana. Back then, applause followed her like a tide. Now, every word lands heavier than a heel on marble. She is Sara Ziff, the model who refused to play along, who turned the camera back on the industry that made her. She founded an alliance, pressed for laws, and said out loud what others only whispered. And when truth arrived before it was fashionable, something colder than winter descended. Bookings thinned, doors inched shut, conversations ended mid-sentence. She spoke the truth before it was fashionable, and the industry could not bear it. The question is not why she changed the course, but why fashion couldn't change with her. She wasn't born into the world of flashbulbs and front rows. Sara Ziff grew up in New York City, the daughter of a lawyer and a filmmaker, in an environment where intellect was valued far more than glamour. At school, she was a quiet observer, sharp, curious, and more at ease with books than mirrors. Modeling was not a dream she chased. It was an accident waiting to happen. One afternoon, still a teenager walking the streets of Manhattan, she was approached by a scout. In a city where everyone is hustling towards something, Sara seemed destined for a different path. Yet within months, she was cast on runways that most girls could only imagine. Prada, Chanel, Dolce & Gabbana. The transformation was jarring. Overnight, she went from Bronx Science High School corridors to the polished marble of Milan and Paris fashion weeks. But unlike many of her peers, she didn't surrender entirely to the fantasy. Between flights and fittings, she was reading, studying, and keeping her eyes open. While others reveled in the illusion, Sara noticed the cracks. The exhaustion behind backstage smiles, the whispered fears of underage girls thrust into adult worlds, the silence when power was abused. The seed of her rebellion was planted not in a moment of glory, but in those hidden observations. She had one foot in the dream, the other rooted in reality. A reality that would later fuel a mission no one in fashion expected from a runway star. By the late 1990s, Sara Ziff had become one of those faces the industry couldn't ignore. Tall, live, with a natural presence that seemed less manufactured than many of her peers. She walked for the most demanding designers, Prada, Chanel, Dolce & Gabbana. Her image appeared in glossy campaigns for Tommy Hilfiger and Calvin Klein jeans, projected across billboards and magazine spreads. She was the archetype of that era's cool, modern, unflinching, a girl who could shift from commercial to couture without missing a step. But what truly set her apart was not only how she looked in clothes, but how she carried herself beyond them. Unlike many of her contemporaries, who lived entirely in the world of fittings and after-parties, Sara pursued an academic path at the same time. She enrolled at Columbia University, balancing textbooks with backstages, term papers with transatlantic flights. In an industry that thrives on the ephemeral, she clung to something lasting. That duality, model and scholar, was as rare as it was quietly radical. The deeper she moved into fashion's core, the more she noticed its shadows. While the spotlight celebrated glamour, she saw the machinery behind it. Young girls pressured into working long hours without contracts. Stories of misconduct brushed under the rug. Agents who controlled both money and bodies with unchecked power. Most models, fearful of losing jobs, remained silent. Sara, however, began to document. In 2009, she co-directed a documentary called Picture Me, A Model's Diary. It was raw, unvarnished, and startling. Through candid footage and testimonies, it unveiled the underbelly of a business obsessed with surface perfection. Viewers saw exhaustion, fear, and exploitation behind the glossy photographs. Picture Me was not simply a film. It was an indictment. For the first time, the fantasy cracked wide open on screen, and it was one of their own, a working model, who pulled the curtain back. From there, her rise shifted course. Instead of chasing the next big campaign, she founded the Model Alliance in 2012, an organization dedicated to fighting for labor protections in fashion. The very act was revolutionary. Models were seen as muses, not workers, adornments, not employees. Yet Sara insisted they deserved contracts, health protections, and the right to a safe workplace. Her movement gained momentum quickly. In 2013, she championed the Child Model Act in New York, which reclassified under-18 models as child performers, guaranteeing education requirements, trust accounts, and limits on working hours. Suddenly, laws were changing because a model refused to stay silent. Mainstream media began to notice. Sara wasn't just a runway star anymore. She was quoted in the New York Times, invited to panels at universities, and recognized as a serious advocate. Within fashion's ranks, this made her both admired and feared. Admirers saw bravery in her refusal to conform. Detractors saw a threat to the system that had long thrived on silence. The rise of Sara Ziff, then, was not only about covers or campaigns. It was about crossing an invisible boundary, from being the subject of the picture to being the one who reframed it. She had entered fashion as another face in a sea of models, and in less than a decade, she had become something rarer, a voice.
But behind the glow of policy victories and headlines, the fashion world was shifting in ways far less supportive. Sara Ziff had crossed a line that few in her profession dared approach. She made the invisible visible. And in an industry that thrives on fantasy, exposing reality can feel like betrayal. Almost immediately after the launch of the Model Alliance, the whispers began. Some agents warned their models not to associate too closely with Ziff's organization. Stories circulated of casting directors questioning loyalty, asking who might be troublemakers. While no one openly declared her unwelcome, the silence of missed phone calls and the absence of new campaign offers spoke louder than words. For a model once in demand by Chanel and Calvin Klein, the sudden stillness was deafening. Her peers admired her courage privately, but were reluctant to stand beside her publicly. Fear of losing work kept many quiet. The industry has always functioned on a delicate power balance. Models at the mercy of agencies, brands, and casting directors. By challenging that balance, Sara had marked herself as different, necessary to change, but dangerous to employ. The personal cost of that choice grew heavier in 2023 when she stepped into an even more unforgiving spotlight. Using a legal window created by the Adult Survivors Act in New York, Ziff filed a lawsuit alleging that, at 19, she had been assaulted by a man connected to the entertainment and fashion elite. The filing named powerful institutions as defendants. It was a case built not only on her testimony, but on the principle that survivors, especially those in industries built on silence, deserved their day in court. The lawsuit made headlines, but it also reopened wounds and placed her under intense scrutiny. Major outlets covered the story, yet the fashion world itself responded with near total quiet. No brands issued statements, no glossy magazines ran tributes. It was as if the industry had collectively agreed, this is not a story we want to tell. For Sara, The cost was not only professional, but emotional. She had long carried the burden of being the spokesperson for change, and now she was living the very vulnerability she had fought to protect others from. The weight of lawsuits, media cycles, and personal history pressed hard. Even as the court process moved slowly, her name, once paired with fashion's brightest, was now linked to a narrative the industry preferred to bury. What made this fall so stark was not scandal in the traditional tabloid sense. No drugs, no public breakdowns, no bankruptcies. Instead, it was the quiet exile that comes when an industry decides someone has become inconvenient. Sara Ziff had not vanished into obscurity by accident. She had been left there, uninvited, because the truths she spoke were too heavy for an industry built on lightness. Still, she did not retreat completely. Even as bookings evaporated, the model alliance pressed forward. But the irony was sharp. The more she succeeded as an activist, the more doors closed as a model. She had traded glamour for resistance, applause for advocacy, campaigns for courtrooms. The fall of Sara Ziff, then, was not her personal collapse. It was the industry's rejection. And perhaps that is what makes it all the more tragic and riveting. For once, a model was not destroyed by her own demons, but by her refusal to accept the demons of others.
In the aftermath of silence, Sara Ziff chose not to disappear, but to deepen her fight. If the fashion world had turned its back, she turned her face toward policy, law, and institutional change. The runway was no longer her stage, the legislature was, and she walked it with the same quiet power. In 2024, over a decade after founding the Model Alliance, Ziff helped achieve one of her most consequential victories yet, the signing of the Fashion Workers Act in New York. It was a bill years in the making, crafted through testimonies, lobbying, and relentless pressure. For the first time, the law acknowledged that models, stylists, and creatives behind the image-making machine were workers, not fantasy objects, but people entitled to fairness, protection, and dignity. The act imposed transparency requirements on management companies, capped commissions and fees, prohibited revenge-based retaliation, and laid the groundwork for protections against exploitative uses of artificial intelligence in modeling. It wasn't just legislation, it was a declaration that the days of unchecked power were numbered. For Ziff, it was a vindication. She stood again before microphones, not as a model used to sell clothing, but as a woman who had reshaped the very conditions under which fashion operated. And though the cameras were fewer, the impact was far greater. She had not reclaimed the spotlight, but something far more enduring: agency, purpose, and legacy. She never returned to the runways of Milan or Paris, not because she couldn't, but because she no longer needed to. What she built was bigger than a single campaign, louder than any applause at the end of a show. Her redemption didn't arrive in the form of a comeback. It arrived in the form of a law. The industry may never publicly celebrate her, but for every young model now protected under the Fashion Workers Act, for every phone call made to the Model Alliance hotline instead of suffering in silence, Sara Ziff is present, not as a cover girl, but as a shield. Sara Ziff didn't exit fashion with a bang. She was edged out, quietly, almost imperceptibly, because she made the powerful uncomfortable. But in the years that followed, the silence around her became impossible to ignore. Every model who now signs a transparent contract, every minor protected on set, every whisper that becomes a report instead of a buried memory,
these are her echoes. She didn't chase legacy. She built it brick by brick, law by law. While other supermodels left behind perfume lines or glossy memoirs, Ziff left behind something more subversive, a change in the architecture of fashion itself. She proved that behind every image is labor, and behind every smile, the possibility of exploitation unless someone dares to speak. Today, the industry she once walked through in stilettos is reckoning with accountability in a way it never has before. And while it may never fully give her credit, the blueprint she drafted is being followed, quietly, persistently, inevitably. She didn't just ask for respect, she legislated it. She didn't just model strength, she institutionalized it. And in doing so, she became something the fashion world never knew it needed, a woman who refused to lie and rewrote the rules instead.